The crack of breaking glass echoed across the ballroom a split second after Lysander's palm slammed across my face. 500 people stopped breathing while champagne flutes froze halfway to lips, and conversations died in unfinished sentences. Somewhere in the corner, the string quartet kept playing for 2 confused seconds before every musician realized something terrible had happened. My cheek burned, not because of the pain, but because of the humiliation. My husband, the man I had loved, trusted, defended, and quietly sacrificed for, had just slapped me in front of everyone who mattered to his career. His executives, his investors, his colleagues, his mother, the photographers, the board members, and the people who had applauded him only moments earlier simply stood there. No one moved, and no one spoke, as Lysander's chest rose and fell rapidly. His face flushed with anger while shards of crystal glittered across the polished marble floor like scattered ice. I looked at him for several long seconds before I reached into my handbag. I was not looking for makeup, nor was I reaching for tissues, but rather for my mobile phone. I unlocked it with steady fingers, opened a conversation that hadn't been used in years, and typed 3 simple words. "Come get me," I wrote, knowing only my father would understand what those words truly meant and the promise hidden behind them. I pressed send, and the message showed as delivered. I slipped my mobile back into my handbag, lifted my eyes towards the ceiling for just a moment, and whispered so quietly that no one else could hear me. "Dad, I finally need you," I breathed. Exactly 15 minutes was all it would take for him to arrive. And none of them, not Lysander, not his mother, not anyone standing in that magnificent ballroom, had the slightest idea that their lives were about to change forever. 2 years earlier, if someone had told me my marriage would eventually end with a slap heard across a ballroom, I would have laughed. I wouldn't have laughed because I believed life was perfect, but because I believed Lysander Croft was different. We met in the least glamorous place imaginable, a muddy church car park outside Hexham, Northumberland. Only 3 days after catastrophic flooding had destroyed hundreds of homes, volunteers had arrived from across several counties to help families salvage whatever remained. I was carrying bottled water while Lysander was hauling soaked plasterboard out of an elderly couple's sitting room. By lunchtime, both of us were covered in mud, exhausted, and arguing over whose turn it was to lift an impossibly heavy washing machine. "You know," he said with a grin, wiping sweat from his forehead, "you're incredibly stubborn." I replied that he was just as stubborn, to which he argued he saw it first since he was already carrying one end. He laughed and noted that he guessed we were both terrible at giving up. That became our first inside joke, as neither of us ever liked giving up, or at least that was what I believed at the time. For the next several months, we stayed in touch, first through volunteer projects, then weekend coffees, then dinners that somehow lasted until pubs and restaurants closed around us. Lysander was charming without trying too hard. He listened when people spoke, remembered birthdays, tipped generously, and rang his grandmother every Sunday afternoon. He dreamed about building something meaningful instead of merely becoming wealthy, and those qualities mattered to me far more than expensive watches or luxury estate cars ever could. Money had never impressed me, perhaps because I'd grown up surrounded by more of it than I ever wanted. My father, Alistair Thorne, had spent 40 years building Thorne Enterprises into one of Britain's largest engineering and infrastructure corporations. His firm built bridges, airports, hospitals, and renewable energy projects, meaning our family name quietly existed behind projects that millions of people used every day. Yet almost nobody recognized him, and that was exactly how he preferred it. Dad refused magazine covers, declined television interviews, and wore ordinary suits purchased from the same Savile Row tailor he'd used for 25 years. He drove himself whenever possible, so if strangers met him at a supermarket, they'd assume he was a retired accountant instead of a billionaire. Growing up, he constantly reminded me of one lesson. Wealth should solve problems, Araminta, and it should never become your personality. My mother had passed away when I was 14, so Dad raised me alone after that tragic loss. Despite every board meeting and international flight, he somehow never missed piano recitals, school plays, or birthdays. He protected me without smothering me, and he trusted me without controlling me. So, when I started dating Lysander seriously, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I wouldn't tell him who my family was, at least not at first, because I'd seen too many people change the moment they learned my surname. Some became intimidated, others became overly eager, and a few became incredibly calculating. I wanted someone who looked at Araminta first, rather than looking at the Thorne Empire. 2 wonderful years passed, before Lysander proposed to me on a quiet walking path overlooking a loch in the Scottish Highlands, where autumn leaves painted the shoreline gold and crimson. There were no photographers hiding behind trees, no orchestra, and no elaborate surprises, just a small velvet ring box, his nervous smile, and one simple question. "Araminta, will you marry me?" he asked, and I said yes before he even finished asking. 3 weeks later, I finally told him everything about my heritage. He sat silently in my flat for almost 5 full minutes after hearing my family's story. "Alistair Thorne," he finally whispered, asking if my father was indeed that Alistair Thorne. I nodded, apologizing that I hadn't told him sooner about my background. Shaking his head slowly, he assured me he understood why, but then another thought crossed his face regarding his career. When I asked what he meant, he explained that if people found out, they'd think every promotion he ever earned came from my father. I reached across the table, took his hand, and told him that no one had to know. He stared at me, asking if I would really keep it private, and I replied that I didn't want our marriage built on my family's name. Squeezing my fingers, he said he loved me even more for saying that. Before the wedding, Dad invited Lysander to lunch, just the two of them. Later that evening, Dad told me exactly how the conversation had gone, stating he had promised never to interfere in our marriage. He also promised never to interfere in Lysander's career, which sounded exactly like my father, fair, respectful, and principled. Then he smiled in that quiet way he always did whenever he was hiding something, sentimental, and admitted he had told him one more thing. When I asked what it was, he reminded me of a promise we made when I was 6 years old, after I got lost for 15 minutes at the village fete. I laughed, remembering the emergency code perfectly. When I was little, Dad had told me that no matter where he was in the world, if I ever truly needed him, not because of scraped knees or broken toys, but because I genuinely believed I wasn't safe, I could send him 3 specific words. He wouldn't ask questions, he would simply come. He told me he had reminded Lysander about that promise, and when I asked what Lysander thought, Dad chuckled softly. He suspected Lysander believed it was just an emotional father-daughter tradition, but it was much more than that. It was trust of the deepest kind. Several months after our wedding, Lysander applied for an opening at Thorne Enterprises, where thousands of applications arrived every year, and competition was fierce. Dad never ordered anyone to hire him, nor did he ever bypass standard procedures. The only thing he quietly requested from Human Resources was to give him an interview. Nothing more. Everything afterward belonged entirely to Lysander, as he impressed every interviewer and worked impossible hours. He volunteered for difficult assignments, and solved problems others actively avoided. Promotion followed promotion, because he legitimately earned them through his own hard work. Whenever I asked Dad whether he'd been tempted to help, he always answered the exact same way. "If I interfere, I'll steal his chance to become the man he believes he can be," he would say. For a long time, I believed Lysander already was that man, simply failing to realize that success can reveal parts of someone's character that hardship never does. Success didn't change Lysander overnight, which would have been much easier to recognize. Instead, it happened the way seasons change, where you don't notice the difference from one day to the next. Eventually, you look outside and realize the landscape is completely different. The first change seemed harmless, as he claimed it would make a better impression after trading in his dependable saloon for a luxury German car that cost more than our first home's deposit. "If you can afford it, that's your decision," I said with a smile, asking if he loved it. He confirmed he did, so I told him I was happy for him. And at the time, I meant every single word. Lysander had worked hard, so he deserved to enjoy the rewards of his success. The second change was smaller, as he began buying bespoke, tailored suits instead of off-the-peg ones. Then came the private business clubs, the expensive watches, the invitations to exclusive golf outings, and the dinners where everyone compared holiday homes and investment portfolios instead of talking about their families. I noticed that he laughed differently around those people, a little louder and a little harder, as though he were trying to convince himself he belonged. One Saturday morning, I was loading fresh vegetables into the boot of my old 4X4, after visiting our local farmer's market when Lysander pulled into the car park. He climbed out of his new car wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than my entire outfit. "You still come here?" he asked, to which I replied that I loved the place. He looked around before lowering his voice, mentioning that some of his colleagues shopped nearby. I frowned, asking him why that mattered, and suggesting he use the supermarket next time instead. He hesitated just long enough before saying it didn't exactly fit the image of an executive's family. I stared at him, reminding him that I had been shopping there since before we even met. He acknowledged that, but I continued, explaining that the Thompsons grew those tomatoes themselves and Mrs. Alvarez saved peaches for me every summer. I told him I had known half these people for years, and while he claimed to understand, I gently closed the boot and told him I didn't think he did. He apologized later that night, saying work had been stressful and blaming the pressure for his attitude. I accepted his apology because marriages require grace and because everyone says things they later regret. But afterward, the apologies became more frequent, and the behavior that required them became even more frequent still. Then there was Cordelia. If Lysander changed slowly, his mother never pretended to be anyone else. The first time I met Cordelia Croft, she looked me up and down with the kind of smile that never truly reached her eyes. "So," she'd said, stirring sugar into her tea, "what exactly do your parents do?" When I told her my father owned an engineering business, she sounded visibly disappointed. Over the following years, that disappointment evolved into open contempt, as she had spent her entire life dreaming that her son would marry into wealth. Ironically, he already had married into wealth, but she simply didn't know it. Because I wore simple clothes, rarely wore jewelry beyond my wedding ring, drove an aging 4X4 that still ran perfectly, and preferred community bookshops to luxury boutiques, Cordelia reached exactly one conclusion. She firmly believed I must have trapped her successful son, making family dinners an exhausting exercise in patience. "Lysander always had such a bright future," she'd say while passing the roast potatoes, adding that he could have married anyone. Another time, she smiled sweetly before adding that girls from little villages knew exactly how to find ambitious men. I wasn't even from a small village, but she had simply decided I was. One Christmas, after complimenting the turkey I'd spent 6 hours preparing, she announced loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear that at least Araminta contributed something. She remarked that cooking was probably more useful to me than earning money, causing the room to fall awkwardly quiet. Lysander chuckled. Not because he thought it was funny, but because challenging his mother made him deeply uncomfortable. He caught my eye and gave me that familiar look, silently begging me not to respond and to just keep the peace. On the drive home, I finally asked why he didn't say anything, and he kept his eyes on the road while stating I knew how his mum was. I argued that wasn't an answer, and pointed out that he let her make things worse for me. He sighed and said he wished I would stop taking everything so personally. I almost laughed, wondering what exactly was impersonal about being called a gold digger in my own dining room. The emotional distance between us grew in ways that outsiders probably never noticed, as he began correcting me in public over little things. It wasn't about important matters, but rather the pronunciation of a wine label, the date of a holiday we'd taken, or a story I had already told. He would claim I remembered it wrong, left out the important part, or insist that wasn't what happened, until I eventually started questioning my own memory. Then came the cruel jokes, like when he told his friends that if Araminta ever balanced the checkbook, we'd probably be bankrupt. Everyone laughed, and I smiled politely, even though I had actually handled our finances since we had married. At another dinner party, he wrapped an arm around my shoulders and said I kept him humble because I still thought discount vouchers were exciting. "I do think saving money is exciting," I replied, prompting his colleagues to laugh again while Lysander smiled as though I'd just confirmed the punchline. The drive home was perfectly silent. I watched the streetlights slide across the windscreen, while wondering when I had become the supporting character in my own marriage. Finally, I asked if we could talk, and when he said we were talking, I faced him and clarified that I meant really talk. He gripped the steering wheel, asking what was wrong now, and I confessed I thought we were drifting apart. He blamed it on being busy, but I insisted it was more than just being busy, to which he didn't answer. I suggested we should see a marriage counselor, and his jaw tightened immediately as he declared we didn't need therapy. I told him I thought we did, but he argued that therapy was only for couples who were falling apart. I whispered the words before I could stop myself, admitting that I thought we were indeed falling apart. He laughed once, not kindly, and insisted we were perfectly fine. "No, Lysander," I replied. "We're not fine. You just keep claiming we are adjusting to success." Success was the word he kept using as though it explained everything, as though promotions automatically excused pride, and as though bigger offices justified smaller acts of kindness. Months passed, and I continued hoping the man I married was still somewhere beneath the polished executive exterior. Then came the major announcement. Lysander had been promoted to managing director, marking one of the youngest appointments in the company's history. I was genuinely thrilled for him because he had truly earned it through every late night, every difficult project, and every weekend sacrifice to impossible deadlines. When the company decided to host a formal celebration, I threw myself into helping organize it. I worked with the event planners, reviewed seating charts, coordinated dietary requests, helped select music, and spent hours making sure elderly relatives would have comfortable tables close to the stage. No one asked me to do it. I simply wanted my husband to have a night he would remember forever. A week before the event, Dad invited me to lunch, never mentioning that he had personally approved Lysander's promotion after reading years of exceptional performance evaluations. Instead, he simply smiled over his tea and observed that I seemed very happy. I confirmed I was, and when he noted I sounded proud of him, I enthusiastically agreed. Dad nodded thoughtfully, said it was good, and then after a pause, added that leadership isn't measured by how high someone climbs. I smiled and replied that I knew it was measured by how they treat the people who can't help them climb any higher. At the time, I thought he was just offering fatherly wisdom. Looking back, I sometimes wonder whether experience had already taught him to recognize warning signs that love had blinded me to entirely. The grand ballroom was booked, the guest list exceeded 500 people, and executives from across the country confirmed their attendance. Investors, community leaders, board members, business partners, and photographers would all be there to celebrate Lysander Croft's extraordinary future. I spent weeks making absolutely sure everything would be perfect. I never imagined I was actually preparing the very stage where my own marriage would abruptly end. The ballroom looked like something straight from an old Hollywood film, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light across polished marble floors. White orchids lined the stage, and a jazz quartet played softly while waiters floated through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with champagne. Every table was dressed in ivory linen, every place setting gleamed flawlessly, and the company had spared absolutely no expense. As I stood near the entrance greeting arriving guests, I felt something I hadn't experienced in many months. I felt hope that maybe tonight would be different, and that this celebration would remind Lysander of where he came from. Maybe we would finally laugh together again the way we used to after muddy volunteer days and cheap takeaway dinners. For a little while, it almost seemed entirely possible. Lysander looked handsome in his tailored navy dinner jacket, and when he crossed the room greeting colleagues, I could still recognize flashes of the man I'd fallen in love with. He hugged old mentors, thanked his assistants by name, and graciously complimented the catering staff. Watching him, I caught myself smiling and thought perhaps I'd been worrying far too much. Perhaps success had simply demanded more of him than either of us had initially expected. As the evening officially began, the company's CEO stepped onto the stage and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "tonight we celebrate exceptional leadership, remarkable dedication, and one of the brightest executives our company has ever developed." The room erupted into enthusiastic applause, and Lysander accepted the standing ovation with practiced, polished confidence. He thanked the board, he thanked his department, he thanked his mentors, he thanked his team, and he thanked every executive who had supported his journey. Then, he specifically thanked his mother, causing the cameras to turn towards Cordelia as she dabbed imaginary tears from her eyes. She stood proudly while guests applauded her again, and I waited, certain my name would surely come next. We had been married for 5 years. I'd spent countless nights eating dinner alone because he was working late, celebrated every victory, encouraged every setback, and helped organize this very event. Instead of mentioning me, Lysander simply smiled towards the audience. And finally he said, "Thank you to everyone who believed in me." That was it. He didn't mention Araminta, not even once. A tiny ache settled somewhere deep behind my ribs, though it wasn't the public recognition I cared about. It was what the glaring omission revealed. Somewhere along the way, I had become entirely invisible to him. Still, when he stepped off the stage, I embraced him and told him I was proud of him. He kissed my forehead absent-mindedly and muttered a quick thanks. Then someone from the board called his name, and he walked away before I even finished smiling. The ballroom gradually relaxed into comfortable conversation, while champagne flowed freely and the music gracefully resumed. Clusters of guests laughed together, while roaming photographers captured candid moments of the celebration. I wandered towards one of the refreshment tables, immensely grateful for a quiet minute alone. That was exactly when Cordelia suddenly appeared beside me. She was wearing an emerald green gown, diamonds around her neck, and the expression of someone fully preparing for a theatrical performance. Several wives of senior executives stood nearby, along with a handful of investors and 2 local politicians, creating enough people to guarantee an audience. She smiled sweetly, saying, "Araminta, good evening. You've certainly done well for yourself." I recognized the patronizing tone immediately and replied that Lysander had done well too. "Oh, Lysander earned everything he has," she retorted, looking around dramatically. "I still can't quite figure out how a northern country girl convinced my son to marry her." A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances, and someone chuckled rather nervously. I inhaled slowly and calmly clarified that I was not from the country. "No." She tilted her head mockingly. "Well, you certainly dress like you are." Another strained laugh drifted through the group, prompting one woman to quietly look away in embarrassment. A gentleman pretending to study his drink suddenly found the glass absolutely fascinating. I decided to end the conversation gracefully, stating, "If you'll excuse me." "Oh, don't be so sensitive," Cordelia scoffed, reaching out and lightly touching my arm. "I was only complimenting Lysander." She turned towards the guests to announce that her son had always been incredibly generous. Then she looked directly at me and declared, "You've been living off his success for years." The cruel words hung in the air, sharp, deliberate, and undeniably vicious. For years, I had swallowed comments exactly like that during family dinners, holiday gatherings, and birthday parties. I had remained silent because I loved Lysander, because I believed peace mattered, and because I hoped kindness would eventually soften her bitterness. Standing in that ballroom, something inside me quietly and permanently changed. It didn't happen dramatically, nor did it happen angrily. It was simply enough. I smiled politely, and my voice remained perfectly calm when I replied, "Actually, I've never needed Lysander's money." The nearby conversations began fading, as people sensed something highly unusual was happening. Cordelia laughed, a loud theatrical laugh, and folded her arms before asking, "Oh, really? Then where exactly did a nobody like you come from?" she demanded harshly. I met her eyes and calmly stated that my background wasn't really the point. "No, dear." She took one slow step closer, stating that it absolutely was the point. Her smile hardened as she accused me once more, saying, "You trapped my son." I firmly replied that I did no such thing, but she insisted I knew he would become successful. I reminded her that I met him when neither of us had much of anything. She scoffed, calling it a convenient story, while a circle quietly formed around us. No one intended to stare, yet absolutely everyone was staring intently. I noticed several executives looking distinctly uncomfortable, and one older woman whispered something to her husband. Across the room, Lysander finally noticed the growing crowd and began walking swiftly towards us. Relief washed over me, as I believed he would finally put a stop to this nonsense. He arrived beside us wearing the polished smile that executives perfect over years of intense negotiations. "What's going on?" he asked, attempting to diffuse the palpable tension. Cordelia answered first, claiming that his wife had decided to completely embarrass her. I opened my mouth to speak, but Lysander didn't even look at me. "Araminta," his voice was low, asking what exactly had happened. I simply began to say that I told his mother, but he abruptly interrupted me. "Just apologize," he ordered, and I blinked, asking him what he had just said. He repeated the demand to apologize, and I stared at him, absolutely certain I had misunderstood his words. I pointed out that he didn't even know what had happened, but he coldly replied that it didn't matter. "It matters to me," I insisted, and he finally met my eyes with an expression that wasn't angry yet, only deeply impatient. "Araminta, your mother publicly called me a gold digger," I explained, to which he replied that he was asking me to let it go. I told him I had been letting it go for years, causing several nearby guests to shift awkwardly. Lysander glanced around, clearly hyper-aware of the watchful audience surrounding us. "Don't do this here," he warned, but I replied that I wasn't the one who started this here. "Araminta," his voice sharpened with authority, "apologize." Something inside me became perfectly and resolutely still. For the first time since we had met, I firmly refused, saying a single no that surprised even me. Lysander frowned, asking what I had just said, and I spoke quietly but very clearly. "I'm done apologizing for things I didn't do," I declared. Silence fell over the group, and even the jazz quartet seemed to falter momentarily. Cordelia looked horrified that I had dared to challenge her so publicly. Lysander's face flushed crimson as years of carefully controlled frustration, pride, embarrassment, and ego seemed to collide all at once. He aggressively grabbed a crystal wine glass from a passing waiter's tray. For one impossible second, I thought he was simply going to walk away from the situation. Instead, he hurled the glass downward with absolutely all of his strength. The glass exploded against the marble floor, and the terrifying sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. 500 conversations died instantly, and heads turned rapidly from every direction. The musicians stopped playing entirely, and someone in the crowd audibly gasped. Lysander took one aggressive step towards me, his breathing remarkably uneven, and his eyes burning with absolute rage. "Araminta," he growled, and I barely had time to register the dangerous warning. His hand struck my face so hard that my head violently snapped sideways. The sickening impact echoed even louder in my memory than the shattering of the crystal glass. Pain rapidly spread across my cheek, but shock spread much farther through my body. Absolutely no one moved. One waiter froze mid-step, still awkwardly holding a tray of champagne. A photographer slowly lowered his camera, and an elderly board member looked physically ill. Somewhere in the back of the massive ballroom, a woman frantically whispered, "Oh my God." Lysander stared down at his own hand as though he couldn't possibly believe what he'd just done. Cordelia said nothing. She uttered not a single word of defense or shock. I slowly raised my trembling fingertips to my cheek, which was already beginning to swell. My wedding ring caught the light as my hand shook ever so slightly, not from fear, but from profound disappointment. I looked at Lysander, truly looking at him, and realized the ambitious volunteer I'd met in a flooded neighborhood was entirely gone. Standing before me was a man who believed power entitled him to inflict humiliation, who believed silence meant permission, and who believed love would always endure just one more insult. He was completely wrong, and without saying a word, I reached purposefully into my handbag. The shocked guests watched my every single movement closely. I removed my mobile phone, unlocked it, and quickly opened one specific conversation. I typed 3 words, "Come get me," and I firmly pressed send. The message disappeared into the ether, and I calmly slipped the phone back into my handbag. Lysander finally found his voice, stammering, "What? What are you doing?" I met his eyes one last time, and my voice was calm enough to genuinely frighten several people standing nearby. "He'll come," I stated, though no one present understood what I truly meant by that. No one understood except me, knowing that somewhere across the city, the only man who had ever promised that if I truly needed him, he would come without asking a single question, was already moving. The clock had officially started ticking down the 15 minutes. That was absolutely all the time Lysander Croft had left before he learned the devastating truth about the woman he had just struck. No one in the room knew what to do next. The deafening silence that followed the slap felt heavier than the grand marble columns surrounding the expansive ballroom. Hundreds of guests remained exactly where they were, as though any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile dignity still lingered in the room. Lysander finally cleared his throat, uttering my name, Araminta, but his voice had completely lost its former confidence. I simply looked at him without speaking a word in response. He took a hesitant step closer and suggested we go somewhere private. "No," I replied, and the word wasn't loud because it absolutely didn't need to be. His jaw tightened as he accused me of making the situation worse. I almost smiled at the absurdity, knowing he was the one who had already made it irreparably worse. A few executives quietly escorted their spouses towards the far edges of the ballroom, giving us space while pretending they weren't watching the spectacle. Conversations nervously resumed in hushed whispers that lasted only a few seconds before dying out again. Someone kindly offered me a linen serviette, while someone else quietly asked whether I desperately needed ice. I politely thanked them both, noting that my cheeks still burned, but the physical pain no longer mattered. The utter humiliation had finally reached its absolute limit. Lysander glanced around at the vast sea of faces, thoroughly understanding exactly what they were seeing. They were not looking at an accomplished executive, nor the newly promoted managing director, but a man who had cowardly struck his wife in public. His mother finally broke the oppressive silence, waving one dismissive hand and declaring, "Oh, honestly, she provoked you." Several people immediately turned towards her in absolute disbelief, whispering, "What?" Cordelia continued to dig her grave, haughtily claiming that marriages simply have arguments. No one answered her. Even those who had politely tolerated her for years now looked incredibly uncomfortable. Lysander frantically rubbed both hands across his face, pleading, "Mum, please." She frowned, asking what was wrong and oblivious to the fact that she wasn't helping. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely confused by the hostile reception. She still foolishly believed the real problem was mere embarrassment, rather than violence and outright cruelty. Embarrassment was all they cared about, as a security supervisor quietly approached Lysander. "Sir, would you like us to clear the room?" he asked respectfully. Lysander shook his head, saying, "No," before forcing an uneasy fake smile towards the remaining guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. My wife and I had a private disagreement," he announced. The word private echoed mockingly in my mind, as nothing about what he'd done had been private at all. He had actively chosen an audience, and now he wanted privacy only because the audience no longer admired his actions. The ballroom doors remained firmly closed, while the large antique clock mounted near the entrance ticked softly. 1 minute, 2, 5, 7, passed in tortuous succession. I wasn't counting because I doubted my father. I was counting because I'd spent my entire childhood believing that sacred promise. Now, after nearly 3 decades, I was finally putting it to the ultimate test. At exactly the 15th minute, the heavy mahogany ballroom doors swung open. No one announced him, and no spotlight followed him into the room. Alistair Thorne simply walked inside wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked almost painfully ordinary. He carried no bodyguards, no assistants, and no entourage, bringing just a simple leather briefcase in one hand. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his expression remained perfectly calm and measured. The room barely noticed him at first, but Lysander certainly did, his face brightening with visible, desperate relief. "Alistair," he called out, hurrying forward and saying he was so glad he was there. He reached out to shake my father's hand, but Dad never even slowed his steady pace. He walked directly past Lysander, as though the younger man hadn't even spoken. That single, dismissive moment unsettled the room more than any dramatic confrontation ever could have. My father stopped directly in front of me, his eyes immediately finding the outline of fingers still visible across my bruised cheek. He didn't gasp, nor did he shout in rage. He simply looked intently at the damage. Anyone who truly knew Alistair Thorne understood a crucial fact about him. The quieter he became, the more perilous the situation truly was. He lifted one steady hand and gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from my face. His fingertips barely touched my skin as he softly said, "Araminta." I quickly assured him I was okay, but he looked deeply into my eyes and whispered, "No, you're pretending to be." For just 1 second, I was a 6-year-old girl again. The little girl who firmly believed her father could fix absolutely anything. He carefully studied the red mark on my face once more before asking the only question that actually mattered. "Did he do this?" he asked. And I nodded, confirming, I did. There were no tears, no trembling, just the undeniable truth. Dad closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, every trace of paternal softness had completely disappeared. He turned around slowly, and Lysander stepped forward immediately, pleading, "Alistair, I can explain." Dad looked at him coldly and replied, "I imagine you can." Lysander stammered that it wasn't what it looked like, but Dad cut him off, stating plainly, "You struck my daughter." Lysander weakly argued it was a mistake, but Dad's voice remained perfectly level as he corrected him. "No, a mistake is sending an email to the wrong person." He paused chillingly. "Violence is a decision." Absolutely no one in the room dared to breathe. The CEO had been standing near the stage throughout the entire confrontation, and the moment he saw Alistair turn, he hurried forward. Then something happened that almost no one in the ballroom expected to see. The CEO stopped 3 feet away, nervously straightened his jacket, and extended both hands highly respectfully. "Good evening, Mr. Chairman," the executive said, and the words seemed to freeze in the frigid air. "Mr. Chairman," echoed in minds as several senior executives immediately stood noticeably straighter. Board members who had been seated quietly rose to their feet almost in perfect unison. One vice president instinctively stepped aside, creating a completely clear path for my father. Feverish whispers spread across the ballroom as people asked, "Chairman, what did he say? Mr. Thorne?" Lysander looked frantically from the CEO to my father and back again, his face slowly losing all of its color. The CEO turned towards the baffled crowd, his voice carrying effortlessly across the suddenly silent ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he smiled politely, "I don't believe everyone has had the distinct privilege of meeting our founder and executive chairman." He gestured highly respectfully towards my father, introducing him as Alistair Thorne. If stunned silence could become physical, it would have felt exactly like that incredibly tense moment. One bewildered investor actually removed his spectacles, as though clearer vision might somehow change what he had just heard. A woman covered her mouth in shock, while several younger managers stared completely openly. Cordelia blinked twice, then 3 times, before she laughed incredibly nervously. "No," she muttered, looking at Lysander and insisting, "No, that's impossible." Lysander wasn't listening to her, because he couldn't. His entire world had rapidly begun collapsing around him. His pale lips moved without producing words, until he finally whispered, "Chairman." Dad looked at him with neither smug satisfaction nor fiery anger, only crushing disappointment. "I gave you my word before your wedding," Dad stated, and Lysander swallowed hard before replying that he remembered. "I told you I would never interfere in your marriage," Dad continued, and Lysander admitted that he didn't. "I also promised I would never interfere in your career," Dad added, prompting another nod as Lysander confirmed he kept that promise. Dad glanced around the ballroom and said, "So, everyone here understands exactly what happened." He folded his hands behind his back and began to reveal the hidden truth. When Lysander applied to Thorn Enterprises years ago, Human Resources rejected his CV during the initial screening process, Dad revealed, causing Lysander to close his eyes in utter defeat. He had never known this critical detail about his own career trajectory. "I asked them to reconsider," Dad continued, explaining that he gave exactly one strict instruction. His voice remained perfectly steady as he recalled saying, "Interview him, nothing more." Dad clarified that he did not hire him, did not promote him, and did not assign him lucrative projects. "I opened one door," he said, looking directly at Lysander, "and you walked through it yourself." Several executives exchanged quiet looks, knowing exactly how incredibly unusual that level of executive restraint truly was. Dad continued, explaining that every promotion afterward legitimately reflected Lysander's own work. He nodded once and affirmed, "You earned them," which made Lysander's shoulders slump further. "I was proud of that," Lysander whispered, to which Dad replied, "So was I." Dad's next devastating sentence landed with immense calm. "When your promotion to managing director came before the executive committee, I reviewed every evaluation personally." He looked towards the captive audience, stating that every single report described Lysander Croft as intelligent, disciplined, ethical, and a leader others implicitly trusted. He paused before saying, "I approved the recommendation because I believed those evaluations genuinely reflected his character." His piercing eyes returned to Lysander as he delivered the final blow. "Tonight, you proved every single one of us completely wrong," Dad concluded. No one applauded, and absolutely no one moved. The raw truth required absolutely no decoration. Dad slowly turned his attention towards Cordelia, who looked suddenly and dramatically much older. "You've spent years calling my daughter a gold digger," Dad stated, while Cordelia's mouth opened but nothing came out. "My daughter hid her family name because she didn't want your son spending his entire life under my shadow," Dad explained. After another pause, he added, "She loved him enough to protect his fragile pride." Cordelia's knees visibly weakened, and one nearby guest instinctively reached out to steady her. She barely noticed the assistance as she weakly whispered, I didn't know." "No," Dad answered quietly. "You simply never bothered to ask." He then turned towards the CEO, who gave a single firm nod in response. The CEO then addressed the entire ballroom in the formal tone exclusively reserved for official corporate announcements. "Effective immediately," he said, looking directly towards Lysander, "your appointment as managing director is rescinded pending a formal ethics investigation." A shocked murmur swept rapidly through the crowded room. The CEO continued, stating that until the investigation was complete, Lysander was officially relieved of all executive responsibilities. Lysander stared in complete disbelief, asking weakly, "You're sacking me?" "No," the CEO answered perfectly evenly. "We are holding you accountable." Two burly security officers approached, though neither actually touched him or raised a forceful hand. One simply said, "Mr. Croft, please come with us." Lysander looked desperately towards me, then looked pathetically towards Dad, before finally lowering his head in defeat. Without uttering another single word, he walked away in utter disgrace. The ballroom remained completely silent as the heavy doors firmly closed behind him. There was no shouting, no revenge-filled speech, and no public humiliation beyond the severe consequences he had stubbornly chosen for himself. Only the unmistakable, heavy weight of true character thoroughly revealed hung in the air. Dad looked at me once again, and his voice miraculously became gentle once more. "Come home, sweetheart," he murmured softly. For the first time all evening, I allowed myself to fully believe that home wasn't merely a place, but the people who never asked me to endure cruelty just to keep the fragile peace. The shocking video reached the internet well before sunrise the next day. In a grand ballroom filled with more than 500 executives, investors, elected officials, and guests, dozens of mobile phones had quietly recorded exactly what happened. By the following morning, viral clips of Lysander throwing the wine glass and violently striking me across the face had surfaced. Those were followed by footage of him watching in stunned silence as Alistair Thorne was dramatically introduced as the company's founder and executive chairman, spreading rapidly across news programs and social media. People passionately argued about the business consequences, debated corporate leadership, and discussed extreme privilege versus accountability. Very few people disagreed about one crucial thing. A man who hit his wife in public had probably done far worse things behind closed doors. The company's formal investigation moved remarkably quickly, though not because my father ever demanded it. In fact, he never did, and he formally removed himself completely from every single discussion involving Lysander's employment. The investigation, he firmly told the board, must be fair enough that absolutely no one could ever claim it was maliciously influenced by him. Independent solicitors extensively interviewed everyone who had intimately witnessed the incident, including waiters, musicians, security officers, photographers, executives, board members, and guests. I had never even met several of the people who voluntarily contacted the company to provide damning statements against him. Several frankly admitted they had noticed Lysander's increasingly disrespectful treatment of me over the previous 2 years at various company functions. One executive's wife quietly confessed to me, "I kept wondering if I should have said something," to which I smiled sadly and replied, "So did I." The thorough investigation uncovered absolutely nothing illegal before the terrible assault. Lysander had not stolen company money, nor had he manipulated any financial reports, and his business performance remained exactly as impressive as everyone had previously believed. That undeniable fact somehow made everything feel even sadder. Talent had clearly never been his problem. Character fundamentally was. 3 weeks later, the corporate board officially released its final decision regarding his fate. Lysander Croft's employment with Thorne Enterprises was permanently terminated for grossly violating the company's leadership standards. They cited him for engaging in workplace misconduct during an official corporate function and subsequently bringing disrepute upon the entire organization. The announcement was only 3 pages long, and it never once mentioned my specific name. It frankly didn't need to, as the objective facts spoke clearly enough on their own. The legal system, however, moved much more slowly than the corporate world. I cooperated fully with the constabulary, answered every question completely honestly, and declined every single opportunity to exaggerate what had actually happened. The unvarnished truth was entirely sufficient to build the criminal case. Lysander ultimately accepted legal responsibility for the unprovoked assault on me. His barrister negotiated through the normal legal process, and the magistrate's court duly imposed the consequences required by British law. Justice certainly didn't miraculously erase what had happened to me. It simply acknowledged that what had actually happened truly mattered. About a month after the traumatic incident, I formally filed for a divorce. Walking into the courthouse completely alone felt strangely incredibly peaceful. For a year out foolishly. Confused silent endurance with actual marital loyalty. I finally deeply understood that they weren't remotely the same thing. Real, genuine loyalty can easily survive a disagreement, but it simply cannot survive physical abuse. Lysander wrote to me several times while the lengthy legal proceedings quietly continued. The first letter selfishly blamed stress, the second blamed alcohol, the third blamed his mother, and the fourth finally blamed himself. Only the fifth letter sounded remotely honest, containing absolutely no excuses and zero explanations. It featured just one profound sentence written simply across a single sheet of paper. I became someone I no longer recognize. I read it twice, then folded it extremely carefully, and placed it safely inside a drawer. Dad noticed it sitting there one quiet evening, and gently told me I didn't have to answer it. I confirmed I knew that as he sat beside me on the terrace overlooking the loch behind his large house. The sun was slowly setting, beautifully painting the water in brilliant shades of orange and gold. I told him I kept wondering whether people could truly change, and his answer came immediately, confirming they indeed can. But change doesn't mysteriously erase consequences, he wisely pointed out. I nodded slowly, mentioning forgiveness. And he smiled gently before stating that forgiveness belonged entirely to me. Another quiet moment passed before he added the profound words I would firmly carry with me for the rest of my life. Never confuse forgiveness with trusting someone again, he warned softly. I looked at him, noting those were very different things. And he agreed they were extremely different things indeed. He explained that forgiveness releases toxic bitterness, but true trust must be actively earned. Some people tragically mistake one for the other, he concluded, and I never once forgot that crucial lesson. The divorce finally became absolute several months later, and I kept very little from the settlement. This was not because I legally had to, but rather because I desperately wanted a completely clean beginning. For the first time in my adult life, I publicly and proudly entered high on Rimmon to Thorn. People foolishly assumed I had simply finally decided to embrace my family's massive influence. The reality was almost the exact opposite of what they loudly assumed. I truly wanted my name attached to something much bigger than mere inherited wealth. With my father's enthusiastic encouragement, but never his overbearing control, I proudly established the Thorn Foundation for Safe Homes. It was a dedicated nonprofit charity organization completely devoted to helping brave survivors of domestic violence and emotional abuse fully rebuild their shattered lives. We happily funded emergency housing, crucial legal assistance, ongoing counseling, career training, and vital childcare for parents desperately trying to start over. The very first woman we actively helped painfully reminded me of myself. She apologized repeatedly every few minutes, saying, "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm sorry I'm crying. I'm sorry I stayed so long." I gently took her trembling hand and told her, "You never have to apologize for surviving." As the foundation successfully grew, I frequently visited women's refuges all across the country. Again and again, I heard the exact same heartbreakingly familiar sentence. I thought it would get better. Sometimes it actually does. And sometimes people truly and permanently change their terrible ways. But blind hope should absolutely never become a dangerous permission slip for someone else to keep repeatedly hurting you. One crisp autumn evening, nearly a full year after absolutely everything had happened, Dad and I sat comfortably on the terrace, watching dry leaves slowly drift across the massive lawn. Neither of us spoke a word for a very long time, simply enjoying the profound peace. Finally, I boldly asked the lingering question that had lived quietly inside me ever since that fateful night. "Dad," I started, and he looked up from his cup of tea. What if I'd sent the emergency code over something incredibly small? He smiled warmly, asking if I meant the one from when I was a tiny 6-year-old. When I confirmed it was indeed the same one, he chuckled softly and swore he still would have come. I laughed through sudden, completely unexpected tears, and asked him if he really meant it. "Of course," he replied warmly, leaning back deeply into his comfortable chair. "Araminta, I didn't create that emergency code to protect my massive company," he assured me. Shaking his head, he firmly added, "I didn't create it to protect our family's flawless reputation either." His voice grew much quieter as he lovingly concluded, "I created it to exclusively protect my little girl." The heavy tears I had fiercely refused to shed in that grand ballroom finally, and completely arrived. I wasn't crying because I was remembering the awful slap, nor was I crying because I deeply regretted my ruined marriage. I wept because I finally fully understood something I had completely overlooked for many long years. True strength isn't constantly pretending that deep emotional or physical pain simply doesn't exist. Strength isn't silently enduring public humiliation, just to foolishly prove your unwavering love for someone. Strength isn't remaining utterly silent simply because you're terrified of making other people slightly uncomfortable. Real, undeniable strength is finally recognizing your own immense worth before someone else successfully convinces you that you have absolutely none. Dad reached over and tenderly squeezed my hand exactly the reassuring way he had when I was a frightened little girl. "You know what I'm proudest of?" he asked, and when I inquired what it was, he smiled proudly. "You didn't ask me to totally destroy him," he noted. I looked out at the peaceful loch and honestly replied, "I never wanted that." He agreed, saying, "I know, you simply asked me to come." That was the crucial difference. Revenge would have been ruthlessly using immense power to ruin Lysander's entire life. True justice was simply allowing his own terrible choices to completely determine his grim future. My father never vindictively took away a corporate career that Lysander had legitimately earned. Lysander single-handedly did that himself the exact moment he foolishly believed his newfound success somehow placed him entirely above basic respect. People sometimes ask me whether I absolutely hate him now, and I clear my throat before answering. The honest answer usually surprises them greatly, because I truly don't. Deep hatred would permanently keep me emotionally connected to the absolute worst day of my entire life. I'd much rather remain happily connected to the brave people who kindly reminded me who I truly was. I want to remain connected to the loyal father who faithfully kept a promise for more than 25 long years. I cherish the brave strangers who firmly refused to pretend they hadn't clearly witnessed public abuse. I honor the strong women who finally found the immense courage to leave their abusers because they heard my own story. And I proudly remain connected to the younger version of myself, the one who firmly believed true love should never require absolute silence. If there's one profound lesson my incredibly difficult journey actively taught me, it is definitely this truth. Mutual respect is the true, unbreakable foundation of absolutely every single successful marriage. Immense success means absolutely nothing if it exists without genuine, unwavering character. The quiet people patiently standing behind us are very often the actual reason we manage to rise so high. But the exact moment we stubbornly choose pride, blatant cruelty, or physical violence over genuine love, we foolishly risk losing absolutely everything they firmly believed we could magically become. If someone in your life ever intentionally makes you feel incredibly small just so they can feel powerfully large, please always remember this. Walking away definitely isn't a sign of weakness. Sometimes it's easily the bravest, most important decision you'll ever finally make. If Araminta's story deeply touched your heart today, I would absolutely love to hear your personal thoughts. Have you ever personally seen someone foolishly mistake career success for actual character? Or watched quiet strength successfully overcome blatant cruelty? Please share your unique perspective openly in the comments below. Your personal story may strongly encourage someone who desperately needs a message of profound hope today. And if you thoroughly enjoy meaningful stories about true courage, poetic justice, loyal family, and beautiful second chances, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for the next great journey. Thank you so much for listening, and please take good care of yourself and the precious people you dearly love.